I've got some disclaimers I want to issue to begin with. Unlike all the other PowerPoint presentations you've seen, this is not very professional. I retired from my last university position. Not hearing me? I retired the last time in 2014, and I left behind a technical staff that always supported me, left behind folks who answered the phones, and now my live-in secretary, she won't listen to me, and she won't open the phones or answer the phones, and she claims she has no typing skills, and I certainly have none. So what we're going to do is talk about dragging canoe in the Chickamauga. I've spent probably 2/3 of my life pursuing dragging canoe. He was the source of my dissertation, which has given me a significant amount of employment over the last 150 years or whatever it was. The other disclaimer is that this is a long paper, and so if you decide to get up and leave, I'll know that's time for me to quit, okay? The last great war chief of the Cherokee Nation, dragging canoe, also known as Chickamauga, emerged at a conference in mid-March of 1775 near present-day Elizabethton, Tennessee. He was born around 1732 or thereabouts in the Overhill country, probably at the little village of Tennessee, which was adjacent to Chota, on the Little Tennessee River. He was the oldest son of Atacalacola and Neone. Neone, his mother, quite possibly was Natchez and not Cherokee, and this may give us some inkling of how he moved around to different towns before he emerged as the chief or the headman at Milago, Great Island. Unlike his famous father, we have no sketch or painting. His famous father, of course, goes to England in 1730. Then we have Ostanaco stalking turkey and codding pigeon in 1762. This is not dragging canoe, but the coloring there is appropriate. This is not dragging canoe, again. This is something that is portrayed as dragging canoe, but of course it's a contemporary sketch. This is my friend, the late, great Talmadge Davis's portrait of dragging canoe. It's really West Studio, as most of you probably know. But it's a reasonable facsimile, and at least a handsome dude to begin with. Dragging canoe was described as being 6 feet tall, muscular, a good ball player. He had a pock-marked face from his bout with smallpox when he was probably 6 or 7 years old. All of you know that there was a great smallpox epidemic among the Cherokee between about 1738 and 1740. And so the fact that he survived is quite an accomplishment. We really know very little about his personal life. We know that he had a son, and I've lost my water. He had a son who was also called Young Dragging Canoe or Dragging Canoe II. As a young man and town chief, he became acquainted with all manner of British officials. John Stewart, the superintendent of Indian Affairs, whose life had been saved by Atacalacola. He had a close relationship with Henry Stewart, Charles Stewart, Alexander Cameron, and John McDonald. He knew about the encroaching white settlements and the constant demand for more land from the white people that he constantly called Virginians. He seldom referred to them as Americans, or at least the quotes that we have tell us that he used this term. He opposed land cessions that his father and the other conservative Cherokee leaders participated in. And in 1775, he immediately and vehemently took the stage, bless you, to oppose further cessions of Cherokee lands. In December of 1774, Judge Richard Henderson and 5 of his associates founded the Transylvania Company with plans to open up lands between the Conoway River and the Cumberland River, part Kentucky, Middle Tennessee. Although he was warned that this was illegal by the North Carolina governor, Josiah Martin, a violation of the Proclamation of 1763, and opposed by just about everyone in the colonial governments at the time, he held a conference with the Cherokee between March 14th and the 16th of 1775, a conference held at Sycamore Shoals in East Tennessee. The events of this conference are very vague. We know that some 1,200 Cherokee men, women, and children go to Sycamore Shoals. We know that the important headmen of the Cherokee were there: Oconostota, Atacalacola, Samanuka, or the Raven of Chota, Abraham of Chilali, Old Tassel, Hanging Maw. But there are also 3 prominent young leaders there. One referred to as Young Tassel, who was actually a Métis, a mixed blood by the name of John Watts Jr., Netituya, or Bloody Fellow, and the headman of the Yalago, or Great Island, Dragon Canoe. In addition to this delegation, there were several prominent Cherokee women. Oconostota's wife was there, Atacalacola's wife, Neoni, was there, Tangdo of Natchez Town was there, and Naiye, or Nancy Ward, the beloved woman of the Cherokee, was there. James Adair referred to the Cherokee country and the Cherokee Nation as a group run by petticoat women. In addition, Judge Henderson and his associates, the Western settlers, were well represented. Daniel Boone was there, John Sevier, James Robertson, Isaac Shelby, Jacob Brown, Jesse Benton, a number of prominent names on the frontier. Henderson and his associates brought about 6 wagon loads of goods, which these prominent headmen wanted to distribute to their young men and try and keep them from participating in any kind of activities that might bring devastation to the Cherokee Nation. The Cherokee offered a piece of land that Henderson refused. In fact, they had already given it away to Virginia in 1770. He finally forced them to accept another proposal, which was basically surrendering Kentucky and Middle Tennessee. The record of this conference is very unclear, but we know that Dragon Canoe got up before them on the 15th of March, 1775, and delivered a very emotional speech. His was one of the most vehement dissenting voices there. In fact, basically the only one. We have several versions. They come to us through white voices, English voices, but the depositions that I've read by about 5 or 6 people who were there combined to give us this speech. We had hoped that the white men would not be willing to travel beyond the mountains. Now that hope is gone. They have passed the mountains and have settled upon Cherokee land. They wish to have usurpation sanctioned by treaty. When that is gained, the same encroaching spirit will lead them upon another land of the Cherokee. New cessions will be asked for. Finally, the whole country, which the Cherokee and their fathers have so long occupied, will be demanded, and the remnant of the Aniwia, once great and formidable, will be compelled to seek refuge in some distant wilderness. There they will be permitted to stay only a short while, until they are again behold the advancing banners of that same greedy host, not being able to point out any further retreat for the miserable Cherokee. The extinction of the whole race will be proclaimed. Should we not therefore run all risks and incur all consequences rather than submit to further laceration of our country? Such treaties may be right for old men or for men too old to fight or hunt. As for me, I have my young warriors about me. We will have our lands. Awanasiki, I have spoken. A day later, actually nearly 2 days later, the Cherokee chiefs put their marks to something that's been called a treaty. Actually, it was a deed. The best we can determine is that they put their marks on at least 9 pieces of paper, and there were basically deeds that were divvied out to the 8 prominent holders of the Transylvania Company. Later, some of these had been denied surrendering the Cherokee lands in Kentucky and Tennessee, especially Laconiscoda. He told those who would listen that they had agreed only to a path treaty, and that's all they had done. Unfortunately, that did not stop the advance of the whites into Kentucky and Tennessee. The acquiescence of the Cherokee power structure simply fed Dragon Canoe's support throughout the nation, but especially a growing spirit in the Overhill country. By May of 1776, the young Cherokee warriors were ready for action, and they had a leader. Cherokee militants were found throughout the Overhill country in the valley settlements. They reached a fever pitch of opposition to the whites when a group of northern Indians appeared in the Cherokee country. They appeared with black faces. They represented the 6 nations: Ottawa, Shawnee, Delaware. Each visitor came black-faced. Each visitor presented a talk and gave accounts of the various injustices their people had suffered at the hands of the American colonists. Probably nothing swayed this audience that listened to them than their account of how they reached the Cherokee Nation after a 70-day trek. They reported seeing country between Pittsburgh and Cherokee country that once had been filled with deer and bear and buffalo were now inhabited by people all in arms. This included 2,000 men assembled at Pittsburgh, 1,500 men on the Cedar River that empties into the Ohio, 1,000 more at a fort on the Louisa River, another 1,000 beyond the Cumberland Mountains on the Green River. They enumerated several fortified places where bodies of men had assembled at springs and bottomlands. Their journey had been a circuitous route, some 300 miles, to avoid being discovered, which proved to be rather difficult given the number of signs of people, horses, and cattle. The northern delegation's call for united effort against Americans did not fall on deaf ears. The Raven and most of the Overhill Cherokee appeared at the council also had black faces. They had already painted the posts in Chota at the council house red. Dragon Canoe was the first to step up and take the war belt from the Shawnee deputy. It was 9 feet long, 6 inches wide, covered with purple wampum and covered with vermilion. The Raven of Chilhowie was the next to take up the war belt and began the war chant. The war song continued as the belt moved among the young Cherokee warriors who were eager for war and to resist the white incursions. The war spirit was further inflamed by the return of Isaac Thomas, a trader sent twice with letters from Cameron and Stewart to warn the settlers to remove from the Cherokee lands. Thomas returned in June and said that the Committee of Safety at Fincastle, Virginia, had refused to remove the whites and threatened the Cherokee with invasion. This was all that the young Cherokee warriors wanted to hear. They were through. The war faction gained additional confidence when James Calvert, a loyalist Chickasaw agent, arrived in Chota from Pensacola with 100 horse loads of goods and ammunition. Seeing that the war faction could not be silenced, Henry Stewart and Alexander Cameron trying to warn the folks on the border. They actually sent letters out to warn the settlers that they needed to remove and go back beyond the mountains. Those letters were copied and changed to say that the Cherokee and all the southern Indians were about to invade the backcountry. They claimed that there were 500 Creeks, 500 Cherokee, 500 Chickasaws, and 900 British soldiers that were about to descend on the backcountry. Now war was evident, and the warriors of the overhill towns ready for war. Warriors from the middle and valley towns, lower towns, agreed to attack the Georgia and Carolina backcountry. But the major strike was to be led by the overhill country and Dragon Canoe. The overhill campaign consisted of a three-pronged assault. Dragon Canoe and 200 warriors against the settlements in the Holston Valley. Abram of Chilawi with about 200 warriors to assail the settlements in the Watauga and Nolichucky area. The third wing under the Raven of Chota was to strike the settlements of Carter's Valley with approximately 100 warriors. The Cherokee strikes did not catch the settlers unawares, contrary to some of the histories that have been written in the Carolinas and Georgia and Tennessee. They were aware of what was coming. 3 traders on July the 8th, with sworn oaths of allegiance to the Cherokee, slipped out of Chota with the knowledge of the secret plans of the assault to warn the settlers. They were encouraged and directed by Nancy Ward, beloved woman of the Cherokee, and other members of the peace faction, who sent them to warn the settlers. They reached Fort Lee on the Limestone Creek on July 11th. John Sevier from Fort Lee to Fincastle County sent out a warning of the impending assault. Other scattered settlements also received similar warnings. So before Dragon Canoe even launched his supposedly secret mission, an assault on the backcountry was already forted up and ready to meet the Cherokee assault. About July the 15th, 1776, the Overhill Cherokee Army of about 500 men made their move up the Nolichucky River. The Raven and his men moved further up the Nolichucky into the Great Warrior's Path, into Carter's Valley. The other small raiding parties were broke off at this time. Dragon Canoe and Abram drove on Fort Lee on Limestone Creek, which they found abandoned. The whites had all moved to Fort Caswell on the Watauga, near Sycamore Shoals. At Fort Lee, the army divided into 2 more wings, with Dragon Canoe striking the settlements north of Holston and Abram advancing against Fort Caswell on the Watauga. As Dragon Canoe's force moved near Long Island of Holston, they encountered the advanced pickets of a Captain James Thompson's frontier militia. The Cherokee force started the firing on the 20th of July in what was sometimes referred to as the First Battle of the Revolutionary War west of the mountains. The Battle of Long Island Flats, 6 miles from Eaton Station, continued as a skirmish over a quarter-mile radius. While the Cherokee attempted to flank the White Army, they had moved such a great distance and spread out so far they couldn't envelop them. So a very furious hand-to-hand two-hour battle engaged. The Cherokee lost 13 men killed, a number wounded, including Dragon Canoe. Despite his wound, Dragon Canoe regrouped his forces and drove up the Holston Clinch, the Holston Clinch and Powell Valleys, eventually crossing the boundary line into Virginia, somewhere north of the 7 Miles Ford and Wolf Hills near Abington, Virginia. The Ravens' force of 100 men faced no resistance in their sweep up Carter's Valley. Most of those settlers had already fled to Eaton Station or across the mountains into southwestern Virginia. His force burned cabins and stations, destroyed crops and livestock. Part of this force drove up the Clinch into Virginia where it appears they joined Dragon Canoe. The rest of the force seems to have broken up into small war parties, raiding parties, and swept northward into Kentucky before returning to the Overhill country. The third force, under Abram, moved up the Nolichucky, marched up Cherokee Creek to Fort Caswell on the Watauga without resistance. There they encountered 75 men and a large group of women and children forted up, and that's where Abraham laid siege to Fort Caswell. Although unable to carry the fort, Abram's men brought devastation to crops, livestock, and buildings all along the Watauga. He finally lifted his siege primarily because they had run out of food or ammunition. By middle August 1776, the Cherokee campaigns had ended in success. American settlements from southwestern Virginia southward to Georgia country felt the attack of Cherokees. Men, women, and children had been forced east of the mountains into settlements in the foothills. Stations and other buildings had been put to the torch. Only one fort was left in the Watauga Valley, and that was Fort Caswell. Within days, the Cherokee assaults on the border brought about 4 punitive expeditions. The first was launched by Colonel, I'll promote him, to Samuel Jack led a force of 200 Georgians into the Cherokee country. He basically burned 2 deserted lower Cherokee towns on the Chattahoochee, on the upper reaches of the Chattahoochee and Tugaloo rivers. On July the 16th, 1776, General Griffith Rutherford of North Carolina received orders to raise a force. He marched his force in September into the middle towns. There is his army destroyed, or most of the evacuated towns and middle towns on the Oconaluftee, Tuckasegee, Hiwassee, and the headwaters of the Little Tennessee. This destruction was achieved with almost no resistance. There was no one there. But when Rutherford reached Waya Gap in the Nantahala Mountains, the Cherokee army was waiting, about 500. And they inflicted significant casualties, although Rutherford only accounts for about 40. However, the Cherokee broke off this engagement primarily because they had run out of ammunition. One of the things that had happened between about April or May of 1775 until about July of 1776, the trade from the colonies had been cut off, which meant the Cherokee were not receiving the normal trade they would receive, and they were not getting the normal supply of munitions, powder, and lead that they would receive for hunting purposes, let alone war purposes. So when the Cherokee launched these attacks, they were very, very low, despite the munitions that had been brought in by Dragon Canoe from Mobile and those brought in by Colbert just before the assault started. Once they broke away, Rutherford's force simply moved into the valley towns without opposition. In the meantime, there was a third army, Colonel Andrew Williamson's South Carolina force of 1,100 men. They had encountered little stiff opposition in the lower towns, but they incurred more opposition in the valley towns. Primarily, mainly because Alexander Cameron had brought together a group of Cherokees and a number of loyalists, and when they encountered the South Carolinians, they were able to inflict a good bit of casualties, and the South Carolinians actually retreated on the first blush of battle. They reordered, however, and came back into the country, torching the Cherokee towns that had been abandoned. They also burned Cameron's plantation on Penny Creek, captured his slaves, and drove off the stock. They then marched into the Neowee Pass area. At Neowee Pass, a Cherokee force of about 500 again struck Williamson's army. Williamson lost 46 men, a number of their horses, and their supplies. However, Cherokee again broke off because of a lack of munitions. It took Williamson's force 5 days to cover the next 20 miles into the Cherokee towns. The two armies, the North Carolina and South Carolina armies under Rutherford and Williamson, combined their forces and drove through the middle and valley towns, basically laying them waste, burning them, and destroying all their crops, livestock that had been stored up. They contemplated driving on the overhill towns, but decided that the mountain passes that they'd have to move their men through would be very difficult to do, and they decided it was a good time now to retreat back to their respective colonies. By mid-September of 1776, as you can imagine, confusion reigned throughout the Cherokee Nation. The Cherokee, especially from the lower, middle, and valley towns, were just swept with gloom and despair and sent out immediately peace overtures to the colonists to bring about peace. Thousands of the residents of the lower, middle, and valley towns went into the overhill country, and this caused a tremendous psychological impact upon the overhill towns and the overhill people. Despite this crisis, and despite the fear that had been engendered by these assaults, the overhill did, in fact, develop one more resistant force. The Fourth Army, the Virginians under Colonel William Christian, had assembled at Long Island and the Holston. Christian had approximately 2,200 men under his command to go against the overhill towns by October of 1776. The Cherokee could only garner about 700 men on the south branch of the French Broad River. The Cherokee force, however, withdrew from that area when Christian's force finally made their move against the Cherokee towns on the 15th of October of 1776. It was about this time that Christian first received a peace proposal from the Raven of Chota. Cameron told the Raven of Chota that there should be no more resistance from the peace towns and they would not suffer, but he was determined to destroy those towns that were associated with the war faction. And he in fact destroyed Great Island, Tellico, Tokwa, Chilhowee, and Seneca. He spared Chota mainly because of the peace faction and possibly Nancy Ward. Cherokee horses, cattle, dogs, and fowl were either killed or carried off. This is one of the things that's kind of interesting about these four groups, especially the Carolina armies and the Virginia army. Somehow they figured out a way to drive off a lot of cattle and livestock and not kill them all. I don't know how they figured out how to do that. The Oconostota, the Raven, Atacalaca, and the other chiefs met with Christian and sued for peace. During these discussions, Christian demanded that Alexander Cameron and Dragon Canoe be surrendered as a sincere gesture for the desire for peace. Of course, the peace faction could not do this. No one could have captured Dragon Canoe at this time, and most Cherokee would not have surrendered Alexander Cameron. Despite the militant spirit, Cherokee's resistance had been sporadic at best. Some of the villages were very weakly defended. In fact, they were not defended at all. One of the things that the Cherokee always did whenever there was a threat of an attack upon a village, the first thing they did was to evacuate that village and find places for security for their women and children and the elderly. So consequently, often when you read about severe burn this or severe dead this, he did it without any opposition because the first order that the Cherokee followed was to protect the women and children and the elderly. If there were any casualties in those villages, they were generally women, children, or old people who simply did not escape, and not very many warriors would have been found there. At the end of the fighting and invasion, 50 towns had been burned, plundered, their cattle and horses killed or driven off, orchards and fields destroyed. Hundreds of Cherokee had died, either been killed in conflict or died of hunger. An unknown number had been taken captives or as slaves, which was very common, especially women and children. Not very many men were taken as captives or slaves. The middle, valley, and lower towns had been wiped out. Although invaded by the Virginians, the overhill towns did not suffer as much physical damage as the middle, valley, and lower towns. let's see if we can advance this. Yeah, right there. Great. I'm sorry. Trying to be too professorial. All the Cherokee were not willing to admit defeat, however. The winter of 1777 found a large number of raiding parties on the frontier seeking vengeance, primarily blood revenge. The law of blood revenge was still very strong among the Cherokee, and those young men who were already following Dragon Canoe were out on the frontiers trying to seek revenge for those loved ones, family, clan members who had been killed or taken. In the spring of 1777, the Cherokee Nation signed two peace treaties, which officially ended the Cherokee War, or the Second Cherokee War, if you will, of 1776. South Carolina and Georgia hosted the first at DeWitt's Corner, and the Cherokee basically gave up their claims to the area of the lower towns and caused a good bit of retreat. By the way, these treaties in 1777, this is the beginning of a shift of the Cherokee Nation from these geographical locations, lower towns, middle towns, out towns, valley towns. Gradually, what we see happening, especially from about 1778 through about 1780, there is a gradual move, especially among the middle and lower towns and among the out towns. They're moving into northern Georgia. And this is the beginning of realigning the Cherokee Nation into upper and lower Cherokee towns. Virginia and North Carolina representatives held a second treaty at Long Island, Holston, in July of 1777. Here, the peace delegates demanded Cherokee cede all their land north of the Little Tennessee River. The Little Tennessee, of course, is where predominant over-hill towns were located, Toquah, Choga, and those towns. The Cherokee peace advocates said no, bluntly. And then, in fact, some of them walked out of this conference. So then the Virginians and North Carolinians said, well, we better make another proposal. So this time they came forward and asked that the Cherokee surrendered all land north of the Nolichucky, except for the Long Island and Holston. Cherokee were never going to give up Long Island and Holston. First, it was a holy place, and second, it became a place of peace. And always been a place of peace, and they were not going to give that up. They finally signed the treaty on the 20th of July, 1777. So as spring and summer were coming to the Cherokee country, there was a major change taking place in the Overhill country. Most of the Cherokee populations, from Elago, the great island town of Dragon Canoe, from Tellico, Toquah, Chilhowie, and Sedeco, began a southward move to Chickamauga Creek, north of Chattanooga, Tennessee. All of this was taking place from about March through July of 1777. This is the beginning of what will eventually be referred to as the Chickamauga towns, and it gets its name from the creek. Dragon Canoe and his followers had virtually led a secession movement, which included some 500 warriors and their families. It was not such a coincidence that they located in the Chickamauga Creek region, because this is where John McDonald was located. This is where his trading post was. Dragon Canoe was determined to ally with the British in order to receive supplies and munitions and to protect his people. He taunted the Cherokee in the other towns for talking peace and not removing, and referred to them as Virginians. Now, when I say he did this, as best we can determine, Dragon Canoe could not read English at all, and it's doubtful he spoke very much English. So much of this would have been through translators or young Cherokee who did have bilingual experience and could talk with him about it. His son appears to have been bilingual. I can't prove that. He called his own followers Aniwiya, the real people. And for the next 17 years, he led a resistance. And the people that he led were referred to as a banditti or Chickamauga. For the next 15 years, he personally directed Chickamauga Cherokee resistance to the American expansion into East Tennessee, Middle Tennessee, and Kentucky. From the spring of 1777 through the Indian-American Revolution, he used British allies, he aided British allies on the Atlantic, and subsequently several Cherokee war groups, raiding parties, companies, and Chickamauga raiding companies and parties moved into the backcountry of Georgia and the Carolinas in support of the British. The secession movement he led took a significant number of young Cherokee warriors. And in fact, I haven't finished this, but I know one 17-year-old or a 15-year-old that became known as Major Ridge later was a part of this Chickamauga group. When the peace party was at Long Island to host them, and they were demanding Dragon Canoe and Alexander Cameron's head, more or less, he led a raid within 10 miles of the peace negotiations. As the American Revolution intensified on the East Coast, more and more the Southern Indians were called upon to aid the British effort during the Revolution. They even planned a frontal assault from the frontier that was supported primarily by the Cherokee and the Creeks, and also the Loyalists. John Stewart, the superintendent of Southern Indian Affairs, was placed in charge of this. And by the early 1778, there was a significant movement of these war parties onto the Georgia and Carolina frontier. On the 8th of January, 1779, Governor Patrick Henry of Virginia wrote the governor of North Carolina, Richard Caswell, "The navigation of the Tennessee River is rendered unsafe and indeed impracticable so long as these banditti remain unpunished. Their present situation on the banks of that river give them command of it. By the means of this communication with our ports on the Mississippi and Ohio is rendered difficult, expensive, and precarious. And the flattering prospects of trade which were opening to our view at New Orleans are lost." So not only were they moving onto the backcountry of the Carolinas and Georgia, they had already begun to move through the river sources and engaged with their allies in the Ohio country, particularly the Shawnee and the Mingos, to control the movement on the rivers. Gradually, the Northern or Western Alliance that Dragon Canoe was able to put together dominated control of the lower Ohio River and the Mississippi, so that there was almost no movement. When there were supply boats that moved to bring military supplies, they were generally taken over by the Cherokee or their allies in the Ohio country. The British agents Alexander Cameron, John McDonald, and Walter Scott worked closely with Dragon Canoe and the Chickamauga and Cherokee leaders to coordinate attacks and bring in supplies. Just as Patrick Henry had noted, the threat to the backcountry was very real, and it was heightened by the alliance that was forged between the Chickamauga under Dragon Canoe and the Ohio Indians. By 1777, and no later in 1779, at least two, if not three, of Dragon Canoe's brothers were operating in the Ohio country. One of the first instances I found was about 30 Chickamauga Indians under Little Owl, but later the number goes up to 60, and then later 100, and then later 120. By 1792, they were living in a complex of villages that were made up of the Shawnee, Ottawa, and Mingos on the upper Miami River in a place called the Glades. And I'll talk, if I don't bore you too completely, I'll get to that point. But a significant movement of alliance, a confederacy. There's a lot written about the Western Confederacy and a talk primarily about the Ohio Indians. But this Western Confederacy that was significantly impacted by Dragon Canoe's leadership. And finally, he was able to persuade the Upper Creeks to join in this alliance about the end of the American Revolution. and as Spanish aid began to come aboard. In 1779, by March of 1779, there were significant Cherokee and Chickamauga and Upper Creek groups that were aiding the British in the Carolinas and Georgia. And although he heard, or some of his men heard, that there was a threat to their villages on Chickamauga Creek and the surrounding area, Dragon-Canoe just didn't believe it was possible. He didn't believe the Watauguans or the Virginians had it in them to carry out such a plan. We know that there was about 75 warriors left under Judd's friend, who was a Métis, to kind of watch the villages and protect the villages. Unfortunately, 75 men were not enough. There was a combined Virginia and North Carolina force under Colonel Evan Shelby that invaded the Chickamauga towns in April of 1779 and destroyed Chickamauga, which was the head town of Dragon-Canoe, and the other outlying villages, about 10 or 11 of them at this point. The worst thing about the destruction of the villages was that Shelby's army destroyed the war commissary that had been accrued at Chickamauga. 20,000 bushels of corn and hides and peltries were carried away, along with horses and powder and lead. These supplies were sold for $125,000. Only about a dozen of the residents were killed and scalped. And again, you can pretty much write it down that the ones who were killed and scalped were either women or elderly men who could not get away. The losses were critical to the military efforts of Dragon-Canoe, and it took him a while to rebuild his military supplies. He immediately solicited aid from his allies in the Ohio country and sent an additional delegation to live among the Shawnee and the Ohio Indians. Finally, in August of 1779, Dragon-Canoe's forces took the field again. Dragon-Canoe, at the head of 300 warriors, joined Alexander Cameron and a company of loyal rangers and marched on the Georgia frontier. There, they accidentally, without foreknowledge, wandered into an army led by now General Andrew Williamson, a South Carolina army that was advancing towards Savannah. So this 300 Chickamauga force with some loyalist supporters encountered a rather large colonial army under General Williamson. They engaged in a running battle, which diverted Williamson from his attack on Savannah, and in fact, probably saved Savannah from being taken by the colonials at this time. John Stewart's death in March of 1779 was another blow to Dragon-Canoe's efforts. And the worst thing about John Stewart's death, they lost a very important ally. But the folks in the colonial office made a decision to send Alexander Cameron to the west to work with the Chickasaws and the Choctaws. And instead, they appointed Colonel Thomas Brown of the British Loyal Rangers as the aide and agent to the Chickamauga and Cherokee. This change probably prevented at least one Chickamauga expedition to support the British in Georgia. In the winter of 1779-1780, the Chickamauga brought a new challenge when they allowed Middle Tennessee to be settled through the efforts of James Robinson and John Donaldson. This just simply caused another thorn to grow that Dragon-Canoe and his forces would have to deal with. In 1780, Dragon-Canoe made the decision to try and eliminate the Middle Tennessee areas, and in fact were able to destroy a number of the settlements. In fact, by the end of 1781, there were only 3 stations that were left in what would become the Nashville area. And one of the reasons they were so successful in this was that the Chickasaw decided that they didn't like the American presence at Fort Jefferson, and so they laid siege to Fort Jefferson and finally forced the Virginians to leave the fort. After that surrender, and they moved back through Middle Tennessee and burn and loot and destroy. And so consequently, the Chickamauga had an ally that they didn't know that they were going to have. What's my time? I'm getting away from my wife, which says I need to cut it off. Give me another slide. About 10 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. The effort against Middle Tennessee was a mixed results. When it was all over by the summer of 1781, there were just the 3 weak stations that were left. The roads, the Kentucky Path, the Wilderness Road, and the other roads that connected from East Tennessee into Kentucky and into Middle Tennessee had been blocked effectively, and there was no more movement of any kind on these roads. Also, following the destruction of the Chickamauga towns in 1779 by Evan Shelby's forces, Dragon Canoe and his followers gradually made a move down the Mississippi, up the Tennessee into the Chattanooga country and developed what is known as the 5 lower towns: Running Water, Nickajack, Long Island, Crowtown, and Lookout Mountain Town. Running Water became the residence of Dragon Canoe and virtually the capital of Chickamauga. It was by far the largest town. It was also where a significant Shawnee delegation ends up, which includes a young Shawnee by the name of Tecumseh, who was, I think, in his teens or early 20s. He had accompanied the Shawnee under the leadership of his older brother, and that's how he ended up in Running Water. Nickajack also had a small Shawnee delegation. The other towns were much smaller, and but continued to be important, of course. In addition to these lower towns, as the Cherokee had moved from the Middle Valley and lower towns and into northern Georgia, other towns grow up very close by and become significant allies to the Chickamauga. The other importance of the 5 lower towns was it put them in closer contact with British supplies out of Pensacola. John McDonald had become an agent for Pate and Leslie out of Pensacola. He had also gotten a connection with McClatchy, and that brought more supplies. And eventually, it opened up a contact with the Spanish, who had taken over West Florida and the Floridas during the American Revolution. The post-revolutionary frontier was a very mobile and volatile area, and the Chickamaugas made it more dangerous for the settlements to grow. Unfortunately, the numbers of settlers moving west of the mountains continued to increase, and one of the reasons was the new states under the American flag were doling out land grants, land warrants to veterans of the American Revolution. And North Carolina led in this to the point that preemption rights guaranteed 640 acres of land. So willy-nilly, these folks were giving away the Western Indians' land, in particular, for our purposes, the Cherokee lands that the Dragon Canoe and his Chickamauga were trying to protect. Dragon Canoe gained a couple of assets in the late 80s. One of them was the state of Franklin, led by John Sevier, and the other was a group of French traders who moved into Coldwater, bringing goods down bringing goods down from the Wabash country to this village located near the shoals of the Tennessee River. In fact, they bragged at one point, the French traders that were there, that they had more goods and supplies than the Southern Indians could ever use up. And so consequently, military stores were now easily available. The other thing is, Sevier, in his anger or his desire to control East Tennessee, launched an invasion of some peaceful Cherokee towns. And there was an incident that occurred where some prominent Cherokee leaders were killed, including Old Tassel and Abram and some women. That brought about an alliance between Hanging Maw and John Watts that was very critical to bring other Cherokee for a time on the Dragon Canoe side. In addition, he also gained a complete alliance with the Upper Creeks, which allowed him to further drive against the settlers that were moving into this part of the country. The deaths of Old Tassel and Abram and the women brought blood revenge movements by the peaceful Cherokee at this time, and that gave them a significant aid to Dragon Canoe. I've got a note here, it says quick, and I'm going to be quick. By 1790, the Chickamauga had another adversary. This time it was the government of the United States of America, who created the territory south of the River Ohio, Southwest Territory, and appointed a governor by the name of William Blood. Despite this new adversary, Dragon Canoe and his folks continued to resist settlements and the movement of settlers. He also indirectly gained a tremendous foothold against the Americans. In October of 1790, his Ohio allies defeated an American force of 1,400 men under General Josiah Harmar in two separate engagements, inflicting over 240 casualties. A year later, in the fall or November of 1791, the governor of the Northwest Territory, Arthur St. Clair, suffered a crushing defeat, losing more than 600 men out of his 1,600 to a combined Ohio Indian force that also included 60 Chickamauga warriors under the leadership of the Badger, one of Dragon Canoe's brothers. So two major victories north of the Ohio, which Dragon Canoe's alliance had helped foster. In addition to this, Dragon Canoe had opened up trade through the Detroit area and built an alliance with the British agent there by the name of Alexander McKee. They continued their resistance and harassment. They continued to oppose the white invasion of their former territories, and even William Blood, known as the Dirt Captain, couldn't seem to bring about his demise, no matter what he did. In fact, he at one point asked Henry Knox, the Secretary of War, to launch an invasion against the Chickamauga, such as the one that was being proposed north of the river by Wayne's army in 1794. No matter where you go, and no matter who you read, there are all kinds of letters that talk about how difficult it was to continue to resist the Chickamauga and how much they controlled the territory. And Dragon Canoe's efforts continued to force a change in plans and the alliances that were developed in the western frontier. Unfortunately, around March the 1st, 1792, this great war leader died. Dragon Canoe died with his forces intact and with them ready to continue the struggle against the ever-increasing Virginians. His death proved to be more than the loss of a great war chief, however. It caused the Chickamauga to lose their unity of purpose, and it caused a significant change in strategy and tactics that proved costly. And despite the brilliance of the young Métis, John Watts, who launched two major invasions of the western country and of the Southwest Territory, it was not enough to stem the tide. And in November of 1794, Watts and the other leaders of this group met to, in fact, sign a treaty agreement that ended the resistance of this militant group that Dragon Canoe fostered so many years before. Thank you.
Video production made possible by the National Trail of Tears Association. The Trail of Tears Association is a nonprofit, membership-based organization established in 1993 with the purpose of passing the history of this significant event in Native American history onto future generations. If you're interested in finding out more about the Trail of Tears Association or would like to become a member, please visit our website at www.nationaltoda.com. There, you can learn more about the National Association, the state chapters, as well as how to become a member. To connect with the association for upcoming events and to be notified when future videos are released, be sure to like the Trail of Tears Association Facebook page and subscribe to our National Trail of Tears Association YouTube channel. Thanks again for watching this video and for your support.